Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Jarvis here, back for another video of what top 8 decks would I play for Vintage Eternal weekend on Magic the Gathering Online. I'll go through a brief breakdown of what I think the pillars of the format, what the best decks are, and what personally I just want to play the most. Magic is a game about playing what you want, having fun, especially with organized play in the situation it's in. So, in my personal opinion, in Vintage, particularly, there are three major pillars of the format. One is Tinker slash Urza Saga. Often you see these cards go together. Second pillar of the format is often Bazaar of Baghdad in the form of Dredge, Hogak, even Squeevine or Hollowvine, as they're called. And the third pillar, of course, is Mishra's Workshop. So I'm going to be picking the 8 decks from among those for the most part, with a few, decks that don't quite fit the mold, but also do something pretty powerful. So let's get to it. And, if you enjoy videos like these, legacy videos, or other things, go right down here, leave a comment, hit that bell button, hit that sub button. Everything's appreciated. So let's get to it. All right. So the first deck I've picked is Blue-Black Saga Tinker. This was in the hands of the Power 9 on Magic the Gathering Online, a very respected vintage expert, I would say. So a lot to like about this deck, in my opinion. It's actually mostly mono blue, and the reason it's labeled as Esper on Goldfish is that there's one Sphinx of the Steel one in the sideboard. That's obviously not quite correct, but it's really a mono blue deck splashing black for Vampiric Tutor, Demonic Tutor, a sideboard Fatal Push, and a sideboard Eliminate. So I generally, personally love playing blue decks that have this Tinker axis or combo kill axis, generally because I think without it, it can be difficult to defeat Bazaar of Baghdad in Game 1 if you don't actually go full-on broken, quote-unquote. So between Hull Breacher and Draw 7s, Urza plus, Time Walk, a lot of stuff like that, it's pretty easy for your Tinker for Bolster Citadel to just assemble an auto win. And note Time Vault plus Manifold Key. If you have the Time Vault, you have 4 Urza Saga, pretty easy to sneak out a win that way as well. And it is theoretically possible in this version to Bolster Citadel your opponent for 10, Urkel's Recall your Bolster Citadel, use Hull Breacher plus Time Twister to generate a bunch more treasures and Citadel them again. Obviously, that's a little bit convoluted and generally not necessary, but it's nice to have that option if it is actually necessary. So a lot to like about this deck. This is why this is my #1 pick for a deck I would play. And I just really enjoy this type of Magic. I used to enjoy Paradoxical Outcome. I think that deck has gotten a little bit weaker, and I think part of it is because the deck often suffers the same issue as ramp decks do in other format. You basically need a critical mass of mana and action, and you run into some of the same issues that, say, Scapeshift in Modern does, or I'm trying to think of a legacy equivalent. Kind of hard to come up with one, but Scapeshift in Modern definitely suffers that problem pretty often as well. So yeah, Blue-Black Saga, very solid choice. Wouldn't fault anyone. In fact, I'd recommend this to a friend of mine, Mental Misstep and MTGO, because he was trying to last minute get qualifier points for the Modern showcase last weekend, and he went 4-0 in a Vintage Realm with it. Kind of blind, but obviously he's a skilled player. But, another good showing for the deck. #2, Bug Midrange. Now, I would like to note, this is not necessarily the order I would rank these decks in terms of power level. And in fact, I kind of don't enjoy playing this deck as much as the other ones, but I also do think it does extremely well a lot of the time. This is really the Jund of the format, in my opinion. I mean, I occasionally see people playing actual Jund, but I think this is a better Jund deck than the Jund decks that you see in Vintage, because the blue cards are just so powerful. if you really want to fight fair, like Reed Duke, this is the deck for you. Deathrite Shaman, Tarmogoyf, that's a classic combination from even the modern Jund days. Oko Thief of Crowns, banned in a lot of formats, while still legal here and still pretty good. I will say this deck is a little bit susceptible to being clunky at times, but it does do the usual Jund thing that if your opponent stumbles, it's pretty easy for you to take advantage and like compound their problems with, say, Leovold, or even cards like Collector Oof. Really just put the hurt to them by constraining their options with either lock pieces or just a fast clock. We'll note that Assassin's Trophy means that I think this is one of the better blue decks versus, say, Dredge or Hogak or something somewhere in Game 1. Just trophying Bazaar and even Wastelanding or Strip Mining it as well, and in combination with Endurance, of course. Just so this is the blue deck that is best versus the graveyard decks, in my opinion. So, again, I don't really enjoy playing the style of Magic in Vintage particularly, but if you do like fighting fair, this is one of the stronger choices. I will say that this deck can sometimes also get vintaged really hard because you don't really vintage people yourself besides the 4 artifact mana sources. You kind of just hope that they're playing fair or that your lock pieces arrive fast enough or you draw them. It can be hard to win with this deck sometimes versus an extremely potent draw from your opponent. So there is that. That's an issue sometimes. But, still a lot to like about the deck. All right, number 3 is Mono Blue Eightcast. I would really qualify this as a Tinker Saga deck personally, but MTG Goldfish has it listed as Eightcast because it has 4 Thoughtcasts and 4 Thought Monitors. It has 4 Seat of the Synod. This really is the artifact deck that is in shops. It plays a ton of artifacts. In fact, it plays 20 artifacts, then 4 Seat of the Synod, that's actually 24. 4 Thought Monitor, that's 28. Urza is a proxy artifact, and Swings of Steelwind is an honorary artifact. It's not really an artifact because you don't really cast it for its normal cost very often. Obviously you can, and sometimes it's really good. And really, one of the things about Sphinx of Steelwind is it's pretty good versus both Bug and Bazaar, generally speaking. In fact, Bug has resorted to playing Brazen Borrower in its sideboard for that card. Obviously not the most, it's not the most exciting option to play Brazen Borrower for Sphinx of Steelwind, but you do what you gotta do, right? There's a lot to like about this deck. This is really, I would say, the descendant of Paradoxical Outcome, in my opinion. It plays a lot of artifacts. It doesn't have as many issues as trying to snowball as PO does, because Thoughtcast you can often play just as like a 3-mana draw 2, which is not the best rate, but that's better than like a 4-mana draw 1 that PO is sometimes stuck with. There's a lot of situations like that. Obviously, I did describe this as a Tinker Saga deck, but there aren't actually any tutors for the Tinker in this deck. In fact, you see no mystical tutors, you see no Black Splash for demonic or vampiric tutor. So really, this deck, it is mono blue 8-cast. You just try to cast a bunch of draw spells and overwhelm your opponent that way. But note, you don't even play cards like Ponder or Preordain or Brainstorm. No, this deck really is just trying to assemble a critical mass of cards. You can see that with Mishra's Bauble plus Urza's Bauble plus Emery. Well-known combination from both Legacy and Modern. More Emery plus Mishra's Bauble for Modern, obviously, but we've seen the Emery thing in multiple formats, and it is quite potent when combined with a 0-mana artifact that draws cards. You also see Vault Key here. Just, again, Urza Saga correlating to getting the Manifold Key for Time Vault does go a long way. And also, in the first place list and this list, the Blue-Black Saga deck and this deck, they both sideboard Karn the Great Creator, which I find pretty interesting. It's because Karn is a one-sided Null Rod. If it weren't one-sided, I don't think these decks would play it. And you see Dismembers for Collector Oofs. This deck is really bad for Null Rod. There's no answer to Null Rod besides trying to force it, but you know, sometimes you just accept the L's. Alright. Number 4, Ghost Shops. The other artifact deck of the format. I actually think this deck is quite good. This is a non-blue deck, but it doesn't really matter. Like, so there is this, I think, maybe floating misconception in Vintage that the blue decks are so much better than the non-blue decks. Of course, like, when you see Ancestral Recall and Time Walk and stuff like that, it's pretty easy to think that. For my pick, I think this deck gained a lot from Urza Saga being printed. Now your Crucible of Worlds are super, super threatening. You have 4 Sagas, 4 Wasteland, 4 Ghost Quarter, a Strip Mine. Sometimes you see City of Traders as an additional soul land in these decks. Sometimes you see Stone Coil Serpent even in the main deck just as like a wall. You know, I really think this deck is quite potent, and it can be sometimes terrifying to play against because it can beat you multiple ways. It doesn't just go like all in aggression like Ravager Shops can, and sometimes there are issues with the Ravager Shops plan. I think Crucible of Worlds being great in the format with all of the utility lands this deck has access to has really, really given it a leg up. You don't see a Cascading Cataracts for your Golos. That's really not necessary. You can Golos for Caracas your Golos for Inventor's Fair, Fair for Crucible, and get the engine going that way. But generally, Golos is just a good card in this deck. It ramps you into something. You can get a second Workshop. You can get Tolarian Academy. You can get Tabernacle if the case calls for it. You can also get Bajuka Bog in your sideboard. Or even Basic Swamp, I suppose. Not sure why the Swamp's there. I guess it's just to have a land to search for opposing Ghost Quarters or trophies. So you might as well just play one. I can't help but wonder if it should be Island for the Mindbreak traps in case if you get into a situation where you want Mindbreak trap and the basic land in your deck at once. It's a corner case, probably not worth thinking about. Anyways, deck's great. Would strongly recommend it. Number 5. Okay, at certain points of Vintage's career, I would actually say Dredge has been the best deck off and on in Vintage. I don't think that's the case anymore, but I do think Vintage Dredge is extremely strong. For those of you who've never played Legacy or Modern Dredge, Vintage Dredge is... Well, sorry. For those of you who have played Legacy or Modern Dredge, Vintage Dredge is just on a completely different level. Bazaar Baghdad, obviously, is kind of the reason why. And this is why you see Golgari Grave Troll restricted, if you're wondering about the one Grave Troll in this deck. For my money, I think this deck actually got a lot better when a lot of the pitch cards were printed. Like Force of Vigor, like Force of Negation, stuff like that. Although this version is a little bit less on the pitch spells. I guess Grief is a pitch spell too. Grief is really good. I used to play Unmask in this deck, but obviously I think Grief is just kind of an upgrade. Because it triggers your Bridge from Blows, gives you food for Icarids. You know, it just a lot to like about it. And generally, this deck is why so many Vintage decks play 6 to 7 pieces of Graveyard Hate in their sideboard, because it's kind of hard to win fair games versus decks. So if you're a fair deck, you basically auto-lose to this deck in game 1 most of the time, barring, you know, Assassin's Trophy plus Tarmogoyf or something like that, you know. Or I guess we saw a bunch of Endurances in the Bug deck, but there are even 4 Force of Wills in this deck. So, you know, this deck does one thing in game 1, which is mulligan to Bazaar, and then try to beat you senseless, either with some light disruption or, you know, supplemented by a fast clock. You even see it go so far as to play 1 Gitaxian Probe and 1 Noctis Revival, which the Revival's not stock, but Probe is restricted. So, you know, it's trying to just play more restricted cards, right? Now, joking aside, I think the Probe is actually there to speed you up, / give you slightly more information for Cabal Therapy. So, you know, a lot to like about this deck if you're into Graveyard Shenanigans from other formats. Number 6, Jeskai Control, aka Jeskai Xerox, depending on who you ask. I took this list from Sperling on MTGO, who I believe is Matt Sperling. Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone out there on the internet. These decks I find really interesting. I think power level wise, they're basically there. I don't generally love their mana base or how clunky they can be. So, but if you think Pyroblast and Plow are well positioned, even like Prismatic Ending is a really good card in the format, I think, as well. All of those things sort of add up to, okay, if I want to play a 1-for-1 game, what are the best cards I can play behind it? Ragavan, obviously an all-star from other formats. Dreadhorde Arcanist, banned in Legacy, still excellent here, especially with Ancestral Recall, Brainstorm, Ponder, Preordain. You know, you can't pump it here, but that doesn't even matter. Lavinia is more like a prison piece, more like a defense grid, more than anything else, that can also lock out cards like Hollow One, or, Force of Vigor, anything that costs essentially 0, Lavinia is just a lock piece for. So, kind of a lot to like about the creatures that are playing in the main deck. And obviously it's vintage. So, any creature you select for your vintage deck is going to be good at doing its job. Otherwise, you just probably would play another spell over it, to be quite fair. Look at the sideboard. Alpine Moon. You see this card often in Modern for Urza Saga, and it's doing the exact same thing here, with the additional caveat that you can side it in versus Bazaar Baghdad, because if you turn their Bazaar Baghdad into a Rainbow land, that's a downgrade for them. Their deck doesn't usually work versus Dredge. The Hogak decks can sometimes still operate, but you will still do it and be happy that you have it. Meltdown is for the constructs as well. I'm not sure if Meltdown is actually better than Dress Down. I haven't thought about it a lot, but if I were playing the format, I would probably try to figure out which one's better, because Dress Down cantripping is pretty appealing to me as well. So yeah, all of that. For those of you who are wondering, Narset is also restricted in Vintage. That's why a lot of these lists play with Narset. To be fair, I don't like Narset as much as other people, but I think in Xerox, it definitely makes sense. Just a lot of broken cards you can get here. Combos with DAC if you really need to go that route by running your opponent out of resources, by making them draw 1, discard 2 repeatedly. It doesn't really take many activations to empty them out after that. So yeah, Jeskai Control, pretty solid deck. Alright, number 7, Doomsday. I actually think this deck, relative to Doomsday and Legacy, is much better. And obviously, that's because it gets to play a lot more restricted cards, and its kill is a lot more compact and a lot less finicky. So, generally what happens with Doomsday nowadays, you get Thassa's Oracle, Ancestral Recall, Black Lotus, maybe Gush, some combination of those cards, generally speaking, and, it generally, if you resolve the Ancestral, you can probably even sneak in a Flusterstorm into that pile. Makes it pretty easy to win. I think this deck is really good because of Thassa's Oracle, making the kill so compact. In the old days, I remember when you had to Doomsday for Mind's Desire Beacon Destruction and use the Mind's Desire to keep looping Beacon with Desire copies on the stack. Now it's just a lot cleaner. Thassa's Oracle, empty your library, easy win. You can even cast Thassa's Oracle, respond with Demonic Consultation, and name something like Tooth and Nail, which is obviously not a card in your deck. And then the Oracle trigger resolves C0 cards in your library, and you can win that way as well. What to like about this deck, I like it gets to play basically all the cantrips and all the disruption it wants to, and it also plays most of the broken card draw spells, minus Paradoxical Outcome or Tinker Siddle or stuff like that. It plays Necropotence still. Necropotence is a hard card to play with, but it is powerful. I would not cut it from the deck, but I would not also be surprised if you side it out a lot, especially on the draw. So, yeah. Doomsday, definitely a really good deck. This would probably be my second pick for deck to play overall. It's just, this is the order I had them listed when I went looking through deck lists. So, yep, deck's really good. You should respect it. This is why you often see Archive Traps in the sideboard. Archive Trap is one of the more effective cards versus Doomsday. I've played Nimble Obstructionist from Rug Control to cycle countering the Thassa's Oracle trigger. Generally, I think those plans are not as insane as they might seem. especially since like I think a more confident Doomsday player, if they suspected obstructionist, could construct a pile with like double Oracle at the end and get around it that way. So, yep, great deck. Would highly recommend. All right, number 8, coming in from. I'm gonna check her name real quick. I know she plays Oath, and I know she's pretty good at it. A Japanese player. I want to get her name right, so. All right, it's Miharu Fuyu Miya. Apologies if I butchered the pronunciation of that. I think Oath of Druids is really interesting and actually got a lot better. And this is Control Oath. This isn't Combo Oath. So there's a lot of things here that I really like that are metagame specific. You see 3 copies of Dress Down. That's a nod to how much Urza Saga she expects in the format. And I really like Archon Cruelty because that one is easier to cast off Black Lotus than a lot of the other cards. And in fact, you can assemble like 2 Orchards and some Artifact Mana to cast as well. You don't see a lot of unnecessary cards in this deck. In fact, the only card that I would say is truly bad is Guy's Blessing, but you can always cycle that one if necessary. And so, really, really like a lot of the choices that are made here. Really clean list. Veil of Summer is kind of a blowout. Like, basically, this deck needs to generally resolve Oath of Druids or Oko to win most games of Magic. You see the full 8 copies of those. And here, Oko even doubles up as a way to enable your Oath. If your opponent just has a random Mox lying around, you have Oath out, you play Oko, you just target one of their Mox and they have a 3/3 Elk, well, your Oath is going to trigger hitting Archon Cruelty next turn, and that's going to be a bad news situation for your opponent. So, really a lot to like about this. Do wonder if 2 Archon is the correct split, but I'm going to trust her over me. Now, the only card I really don't understand is, what's with this Pulse of the Tangle in the sideboard? And for those of you who don't know, Pulse of the Tangles is a card from the Pulse cycle from, I want to say 5th Dawn? Or it's from Darksteel. It's 1 GG sorcery, put a 3/3 beast creature token into play. Then, if your opponent controls more creatures than you, return Pulse of the Tangle to its owner's hand. I don't really know what it's for or what it's doing, so I would look at that card very suspiciously and probably cut it. Besides that, I think a lot of the other choices make sense. I might have a few more Veil of Summers in my sideboard instead of like the other cards there, but no, mostly things make sense, I think. So those are my top 8 decks for Eternal Weekend. And one sec. Again, if you like this video, go down here, hit that bell button, leave a comment, and check out my socials down there. Thanks for watching.